Awesome. So welcome to the Spiritual Intelligence Brief. I'm your host, John Redenbow, and we have with us Pastor Dana Coverstone. This will be the third or fourth interview we've done with you, but the third podcast. And I just appreciate your time, your availability, and for jumping in with us on the spiritual intelligence side. It's kind of a whole new world that a lot of people aren't familiar with, but we talked about that in another podcast. So let's jump right in and talk about this dream. This was dream 3. This was the third dream you had in the first video that was released. And I feel like this is probably one of the most important dreams in what I've seen that you've had. And I feel like a lot of people don't have any idea. What are your thoughts?
I think what happened online was that I posted this on Wednesday, June 24th. Friday night, I got my first picture from a McDonald's drive-thru in Miami Beach, Florida, from a friend I went to college with, who said, "Hey, I just saw this in a drive-thru," and it basically said, "Please have exact change or a debit credit card because there's a shortage on change right now." By that Monday, 3 days later, I was receiving 300 and 400 pictures of signs like that from all over the country. Mostly businesses, retail places. And so I think what happened was after the coin shortage started and the signs started going up, somebody said, "Hey, this guy saw this," and then started sharing the video without really paying attention to the first two dreams. But the coin shortage is what got their attention. And then they started listening more and took it more at face value. So I think, in one sense, the coin shortage dream is what caught the attention of people, because that's something they saw in real time happen right there and right then. The signs went up 3 days after I posted the dream.
Wow. Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this dream is, and our format today might be a little bit different because we got a lot of information we got to get through, but I see this dream as a complex allegory. Now, again, we've talked in past podcasts about the idea of there being 7 different layers to dreams. I believe that it can have a financial component in that we're seeing the signs for shortages of change. The U.S. Mint hasn't stopped printing. It's not like they're going to an all digital currency. I think that could happen at some point in the future. That's not happening currently. I just want to be clear about that. I don't believe that's what the dream says. The hyperinflation stuff, I've talked to some people that are, really well versed in the banking community, and they're like, do you have any idea what, like 30% increase is not a hyperinflation, or 50% increase is not hyperinflation. Like, it's way, way, way worse than that. And so I even, based on the interpretation that the direction that I took was, this is a national level dream specifically related to intelligence about the election. I think it can have repercussions in the financial world. I do not believe the dream is about finances. I believe the dream is it's a hidden coded message. And it's something that God wanted us to be aware of. And when we talked about in the last podcast, or in the podcast 2, when we talked about brace yourself, how you're going to see some things that are so shocking that you would not believe them. I believe that's specifically preparing us for what we're about to see in Dream 3. So what I want to do is go ahead and read the dream as you said it, because I transcribed it word for word. There's a little pre-dream part that I think was actually has bearing on the dream, that you just kind of gave a little bit of context. The dream is super short. So I'm going to read the dream and then we're going to jump right in. So it was a dream given to Dana Coverstone, June 23rd, 2020. In this dream, we had just had a yard sale to help fund a team going to Ecuador this next year. And we had a yard sale, and I asked our secretary to get us some change for that yard sale. So in the dream I'm having, I walk to the bank. I walk into the bank to get some change, and on the door it says there's no change available. I saw the sign and it registered in my mind, but I walked on in, and the president of the local bank was at the teller station. And she was going to be taking care of business. And I said, "I need $10 in quarters for a yard sale." And she said, "I'm sorry, but the U.S. Mint is no longer making currency or making change, like pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, half dollars. And we're not doing that anymore. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, they stopped doing it. And I said, well, how am I going to be able to make change? How am I going to be able to charge $1.50 for anything? And she said, prepare for hyperinflation and just charge $2. And then she said to me in the dream, oh, and by the way, the $1 and $5 bills will follow soon after that. And then I heard those words, brace yourself, brace yourself, brace yourself. And I woke up and I wrote these things down. Okay, so we're going to hop right into this. Again, for some reason, your dreams really captivated me, specifically because I felt the importance that they had on a national level. And so after our first interview, which was right after you had released your video, I felt like I needed to full-time press in and find out what these meant. Now, I spent, I think I told you, about 30 days on putting what I call an intelligence dossier together on your 3 dreams. It's a dossier we haven't released publicly. We might release it, or we might release parts of it. There's sensitive information in there. I haven't marked confidential. But the reason is because it names names of things that are happening, particularly in the political arena. And most of that has to do with this dream, Dream 3. Now, it was probably 3 weeks into studying your dreams that I started to get revelation on what Dream 3 was. And it blew my mind. And so the way that I do in dream interpretation, and what I call spiritual intelligence is not just dream interpretation. It's looking at other sources of information. It's not being afraid of information. I look at Dream 3 in the context of your 2 other dreams, but also in context of other national dreams that are similar that I've gotten, as well as headlines of what's actually going on in the world that confirm the things that are happening in your dream, like we've seen in Dream 1, like we've seen in Dream 2. And so what happens to me is the way that I do dream interpretation is I don't use dream dictionaries. I don't look stuff up in a, what does a car mean? A car means ministry. No, a car can mean 100 different things depending on the context. So what I do is I just get quiet and I ask God, what does this mean? But the first thing I do is I read the dream and I write every single symbol down. Yard sale is a symbol. Funding a team is a symbol. Ecuador is a symbol. Next year is a symbol. So I say, God, what do all of these things mean? And I just listen to the Holy Spirit. And then I get an answer and I write that answer down. I don't judge the answer. I write it down. Sometimes it doesn't make sense at all. Sometimes I'll go look something else up. Like God will say Thomas Jefferson. And I'm like, well, what the heck does Thomas Jefferson have to do with anything today? And then it's like, go look it up. And then I'll realize that there's parallels in this dream between Thomas Jefferson and somebody that's in the public square today. And so that's how I do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin to unpack how this interpretation came to me. And when I say, this is what I heard, that's what I mean. So the first part was the pre-dream, which provides the context. And you said, in this dream, we had a yard sale. First thing I heard was a selling out of the land. And I had no idea what that meant. Yard sale, like selling the land. And I'm like, okay, well, I wrote it down. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And then to fund a team. And I'm like, okay, so this is one entity that wants to provide financial resources to another group to go somewhere and influence things. So funding a team to Ecuador. And I'm like, Ecuador, okay. I know the country Ecuador, obviously, but Ecuador is a symbol. And I'm like, I don't understand what Ecuador means. And I felt like I should look up specifically on Google, what does the name Ecuador mean? And Ecuador means Republic of the Equator. And I'm like, okay. Now I know what the equator is, but what is the legal definition of equator? And to me, and so I looked it up, and the definition of equator is invisible dividing line between north and south. And immediately in my mind, I was like, oh, like the Mason-Dixon line, which is the line we had in America during the Civil War that separated, the North from the South, And so I was like, well, that's really interesting. A selling of the land to fund a team to go to the Republic of invisible dividing line between North and South, or Republic of invisible dividing line during the Civil War. And I'm like, is this dream saying that there's going to be a group of people that are trying to sell out America that are going to fund a team to turn this republic into a civil war or to cause an invisible dividing line? And again, as I'm unpacking this, it's not making sense to me, but this is where I'm going and this is what I'm seeing. And I'm like, okay. And then he said, I asked our secretary to go get some change. Well, the implication in the dream is he's going to get change. So the secretary clearly didn't do her job. She didn't get the change that he needed in the pre-dream. Now, what I thought was interesting is the secretary was female. What I also thought was interesting was I heard a secretary that has to do with international relations. And so immediately in my mind, I'm thinking Secretary of State. Who's a female Secretary of State? And I'm like, we don't have a female Secretary of State right now, but we did a couple of years back. And so I'm like, okay, I'm not sure what that has to do with the dream, but I'm just kind of holding all of these things in tension as I'm beginning to unpack this. So I believe the pre-context of the dream is that there's been a selling out, or there's attempting to be a selling out of the land by sending a team in to influence in a place of invisible dividing lines, or in a place of tension, or in a place of civil war. And there's a female Secretary of State potentially that may be involved in that process. So that's what I got out of the pre-dream. So that's probably not what you thought when you wrote that or said that, was it?
No, I saw nothing of that. I just simply saw a coin shortage, which began to happen 3 days later with signs going up, and also conveys to me that you've seen and others have seen a lot of depth in the dreams that I wouldn't have connected the dots. I do read a lot. I read a lot of books, read a lot of news. I read a lot of scripture. I stay up on things. I consider myself well-read. I like trying to discover plots and figure things out. I love logic puzzles. I love stuff like that challenges my brain. And so when you sent me the dossier and I began to read through this part, I thought the most interesting stuff you would say would be like Dream 1 and Dream 2. I found myself as fascinated about what you saw with Dream 3 as anything else. And it was like, tell my wife, look at this. You ought to say, hey, look at this. I've never saw it, And so I appreciate the way you looked at it, because you were prayerfully looking at it and taking your time and saw things that there's no possible I ever would have dreamed. I never would have seen it in the literal sense, like you were in the and not the metaphysical sense, but just your talent, your ability to interpret and look at these dreams in the context of what they were. I was amazed. I was amazed.
Yeah, this dream was such a surprise to me. Like, I can't tell people how surprised I was. A lot of times I work at night. I set my own schedule. Spiritual intelligence, this is what I do full time. So I'm full-time focused on interpreting dreams, particularly dreams that have a national level influence or a policy kind of making. And there's people, whether they're CEOs or people in government or governmental advisors, that I provide information to that use this as actionable intelligence. And so I think it's really interesting. And this, again, shows the partnership that we see all through Scripture of a dreamer and an interpreter. And God not only speaks to a dreamer in the language of the dreamer, but in the language of the interpreter that they may not have even met yet, which I think is amazing, because I've been a news junkie. I'm less of a news junkie now, because most of it, I just see right through the agenda behind it. And like when I turn on my Apple News and I scroll through it, I spend more time disliking articles than anything else, because they're just peddling fear and misinformation. And so it's been hard for me to stomach that. But what I've done in this season, particularly since the end of last year and the start of COVID, is I just positioned myself and said, God, I want to hear what you're saying in this strange and weird time. And so I started looking at all of the dreams from all of the major prophetic voices and the prophetic words. And during the first 4 months of this year, I think we collected 158 dreams and like 50 prophetic words from known people in the prophetic, and being able to discern, God, what are you talking about? And so positioning myself to hear from God in that way is something that I would encourage people to do. if you turn off the news and you just really position yourself to say, God, what are you saying in this time? You value your dreams, you write your dreams down, you look at what other people are hearing in dreams, then you can begin to get a different picture. And again, I'm going to go into later, we'll probably do some other podcasts about how to do this, what it looks like. But right now, this is being the spiritual intelligence briefing. I want to provide the information that came from the intelligence analysis, not necessarily tell people how to do that. We can do that later. But
Yeah.
I found it interesting in the next part. In the dream I'm having, I walk to the bank. And my first thought was, when was the last time you walked to the bank? You know, when I was a kid, I used to bank at the credit union associated with the Catholic Church about 10 blocks away from my house. And my dad would get his paycheck on Friday. And, you know, as a 10-year-old, my dad and I would walk down to the bank and cash his check. And I still have an account. They pulled out my signature card a while back and they said, could you redo your signature card? And I realized I signed it like in crayon when I was 8 years old. And my signature had changed. But I literally have been banking with this bank for, you know, several decades. But walking to the bank to me signifies not having a vehicle to drive, because I don't walk to the bank anymore. I drive or I do online banking. So walking to the bank means not having the vehicle to destiny to be able to go to access the cash or the capital that you need. And I'm like, well, that's really interesting. But then you walk into the bank with a specific purpose, as you said in the dream, and language is important. I walk into the bank to get some change. That's the goal. I'm going for change. Change is what I'm seeking. You know, and again, this is a play on words. This is one of the ways that God speaks figuratively. And on the door, it says no change available. The first thing I thought in my mind was, wasn't there a political campaign in past recent years that was change or hope in change? And I looked it up, and there were actually three. There were three in the former administration. There was change we can believe in, the change we need, and simply the word change. These were political slogans for presidential campaigns within the last election and the election before that, within the last administration. And so when I heard no change available, I'm like, well, that doesn't mean coins. That's where the dream started to be like, this means something else other than coins. But I thought, okay, well, just wrote it down. What does that mean? So then I continue with the dream. I saw the sign and it registered in my mind, reminded me of a cash register. But I walked on in, and the president of the local bank was at the teller station. Now, this is where it really gets interesting, because, and he said, and she was going to take care of business. So what I heard was the local president bank teller, or I heard the woman, because it's a she, who wanted to become president, but stayed local. And I'm like, well, there's only been one woman that I know of that's ran on a major party ticket for president of the United States. And that was in the last election. And I'm like, interestingly enough, I started thinking about the pre-dream, and the secretary with Ecuador represented a female secretary of state. And I'm like, wow, this same person was also a female secretary of state. And I'm like, this is weird. Like, what, you know, I thought this dream was about coins, right? I thought this dream was about hyperinflation and banking. And, you know, I've owned a finance company, so I was excited. God, what are you going to do in the economy? And now we're talking about politics, campaign slogans, secretaries of state, people running for president. And I'm like, what does this mean? And then, so it was the female bank person that wanted to be president, but stayed local. Well, the last position that this person held was as the distinguished senator from New York, which is local representation. Ran for president, but stayed local. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then I heard the words bank teller. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Well, there was a controversy early in this person's political career where her husband at the time was a governor, and she was representing a bank that was under investigation by regulators that her husband, the governor, had appointed. And they saw that as a conflict of interest. But I saw in my mind's eye, if you go to court and you have an attorney what are they doing? They're telling your story. If you're a bank, then that person could also be called a bank teller. And so I'm like, female who wanted to be president but stayed local, bank teller. I'm like, wow, this is all talking about the same person. Now, I further looked up that person and the word bank, and I realized that there was a controversy a couple of years back where she made, I believe it was $2 or $3 million by speaking to, I think it was 11 Wall Street banking firms. And I've been a public speaker, and a lot of times you're referred to as like a town crier or an entertainer or a teller because you're a teller of stories. And somebody that's spoken to the point of making multiple millions of dollars speaking before banking firms could also be another indication of local president, female bank teller. And I'm like, wow, so there's so much confirmation related to this particular person, both in the pre-dream and in just the first few lines of this dream, that I'm starting to be like, where is this going? Again, I thought this dream was about banking. Yeah. So it's really interesting because the dream takes a little bit of a turn here. You say, I need $10 in quarters for a yard sale. So the first thing that I heard was 40 pieces of silver. And I'm like, well, that's odd. I never would have used that language when talking about $10 worth of quarters, but $10 in quarters is in fact 40 pieces of silver. And I thought, what does that mean? In my mind, I felt like the Holy Spirit was telling me this is a biblical reference. Now, I immediately knew what 30 pieces of silver was, right? It's what Judas betrayed Jesus for. It was 30 pieces of silver. I'm like, I know what 30 pieces of silver is. I don't have any idea what 40 pieces of silver is. So I looked up 40 pieces of silver in the Bible, and I came across this reference in Nehemiah, which is absolutely fascinating to me. Because it specifically talks about the former administration. And it's Nehemiah 5:14-18 in the Amplified. And it says, moreover, from that day, I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah. From the 20th year, and I'm like, it's 2020. That's interesting. From the 20th year to the 32nd year of King Xerxes for 12 years, 12 meaning government, neither I or my relatives have eaten the governor's food allowance, but the former governors or the former administration who were in office before me put heavy burdens on the people and took food and wine from them, in addition to 40 shekels or 40 pieces of silver. And it says an excessive monthly salary. And their servants assumed authority over the people. But I did not do so because of the reverent fear of God. I also applied myself to the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land, and all my servants were gathered together there for work. And so I'm like, this is talking about the former administration, and it's by a ruler who's saying, I am not personally taking a salary. I'm going to focus on building the wall. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That can be no other than our current president, who has chosen to not take a presidential salary, and who the first part of his administration, the huge controversy about it, was focused on building the wall. But it's talking about, this is what the former administration did, and the person who I believe represents the secretary and the local bank president was a member of the former administration. So I'm like, it's fascinating to me how a piece of scripture can talk about things like the 20th year and can talk about stuff related to the former administration and have 3 or 4 ties into a particular person that is alive today, that had we not had this dream, we never would have made those connections. So this is amazing. Did you have any comments at this point? I know I need to give a lot of information out, but.
Oh, no, I want you to continue to share, because it's still fascinating to me to hear somebody talk about it like this. So please go right ahead.
Okay. So the 40 pieces of silver I thought was really, really interesting. And it led me to do some more research and to look at things in a different way. I looked very closely at the other words that were said. I was looking at the words that were spoken by this person when you went in and said, hey, I need change. And one of the things that they said was, the U.S. Mint is no longer printing change. And so I looked up and I felt like God said, look up US Mint. And I'm like, okay, I don't really know anything about the US Mint. I looked up the US Mint, and there's 4 US mints that print coins. There's San Francisco, Denver, Philadelphia, and West Point in New York. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. And so I looked up, I thought because of COVID, did any of these, did they stop printing coins? Like maybe this is a literal thing in the dream. Because that's what, again, what I was thinking was, in my understanding, this is about finances. It's about banking. Maybe the US Mint did stop printing. Maybe there's a coin shortage coming. Maybe it's hyperinflation. But as I'm beginning to unpack this, I'm starting to see patterns related more to politics and elections than I am related to finances. So I looked up the status of the US Mint. So San Francisco was closed during COVID. It still may be closed. Last time I looked, it was. Philadelphia and Denver were unaffected. West Point, somebody got sick early on. They got COVID. They closed the whole US Mint for 2 or 3 days, and then they reopened it. A lot of times in dream and in spiritual intelligence, when we see an anomaly, something that's different or out of the ordinary, we press into the anomaly to get more information. So I realized I didn't really know anything about West Point, but I felt like West Point was being highlighted because it's the only one. All the other ones were either stayed open or one shut down, but this was the one that was closed for a minute and then reopened. And so I started looking into West Point, and what I realized is West Point is the oldest continuously occupied military post in the United States, located on the Hudson River in New York. Now, it was identified by George Washington as being the most important strategic position in America during the American Revolution. I had no idea. So this is a base that has been occupied since the Revolution, since really before we were officially launched, before we had a president. West Point has been occupied. And so on January 27th, in 1778, there was a Brigadier General Samuel Holden Parsons and his brigade crossed the ice on the Hudson River, climbed the plain to West Point, and from that day to the present, since 1778, West Point has been occupied by the United States Army. It comprises 16,000 acres, also the campus of the United States Military Academy, which is commonly called West Point. And so one of the things that as I continued to read, there's something here that I didn't know related to Benedict Arnold. And if you've ever heard the name Benedict Arnold, most of us have heard of Benedict Arnold as being one of the most treasonous people in the history of our country. I had no idea why he was treasonous. I'm a student of history, but I just didn't know the story. And as I'm reading the second paragraph, it says this: "And perhaps the most infamous act of treason in American history, General Benedict Arnold attempted to turn the site over to the British Army in 1780 for a bribe consisting of a commission as a brigadier general in the British Army and a cash reward of £20,000, which is about $1.3 million nowadays. The plot failed. British Major General John Andre was captured. He was a spy. He was captured by the Americans, and he was killed. He was hung. So he was the go-between between the general on the British side that Benedict Arnold was trying to sell the base to. Now, I immediately, as I'm reading this, I heard a selling out of the land. Like, this is related to the reference to do with the yard sale. Like, oh my gosh, this, my head's like exploding. Like, I had no idea that US Mint would be specifically talking about West Point, and it would be talking in particular about a selling out of the land, the most infamous attempt to sell out the land of America in US history by Benedict Arnold in 1780. I'm like, man, this is phenomenal. This is amazing. And so I'm starting to see a theme of betrayal. We see the 40 pieces of silver, and they talked about how the former administration, they lorded it over the people. They charged an excessive amount of cash or taxes, basically, of the people. The current administration didn't take a salary, focused on the protection of the people, which was rebuilding the wall. Again, I'm talking about Nehemiah, obviously ramifications for what's happening politically today. And then there's the selling out of the land that has to do with the 40 pieces of silver related to this discussion, which was just, in my mind, it was fascinating.
Yeah.
So did you have any comments at this point, Dana?
Once again, just as you unpack this, you saw things I never would have thought of, seen, dreamed of, because your connection with history and understanding how those things work. And that's why I appreciate so much. You guys did the first interview with me and treated me with absolute kindness in light of all the other people who were addressing the dream at that time, who obviously hadn't seen anything like you guys would or did. And I'm just appreciative that somebody was able to look at it and pull that stuff out that I never would have seen on my own.
Yeah, it was it was a privilege to be a part of this spiritual intelligence uncovering, because I feel like this is one of the most important historical dreams, perhaps for this year. Again, I've seen probably every major dream that just about every major prophetic person nationally and internationally has had in the last 8 months. And this one, there's so much weight on it. I just felt like God apprehended me and said, you need to get the interpretation of this dream. And so I just continued to go back, and Joseph and Daniel both said the interpretation comes from the Lord. So it's not my ability to put stuff together. It's simply a matter of posturing yourself to sit down and say, God, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And give me wisdom. And what does this mean? And go to sleep and have a dream about the dream, which happens to me a lot. And ask more and put the dots together and research history. And I've read probably 3 books related to Benedict Arnold, related to Thomas Jefferson, related to the intelligence spy network that George Washington had that circumvented the Benedict Arnold play because of this dream. Like, I've really decided I'm going to lean in, and the books that I'm going to read and the news and the documentaries that I'm going to watch are going to be specifically related to the dreams that I'm working on. That's how I've positioned my life to be able to hear from God in a different way than most people who are hearing all of the noise of the fear and the confusion that's going on in the land today.
Yeah.
So we got about 5 minutes before you got to head out, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get into the change, and then we're going to cut it there, and we're going to have to finish this in a part 2, but there's so much information here. When the local president bank teller says there's no change, she mentions there's no pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, half dollars. And my first thought was like, as if we needed somebody to tell us what change was. Like, we know what change is. Like, you didn't have to mention those specifically. And I felt the question, and a lot of times this is how God works with me, is he'll ask me a question. And I felt the question, whose face is on pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, half dollars? And since the sign said no change available, what I felt was, so it's Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, FDR, George Washington, and JFK. And I'm like, okay, great. What does those 5 former presidents have to do with anything? And I felt like God was saying, what is the legacy of each one of those people? And this person is declaring that if she gets her way, or under her type of rule, her type of administration, this type of change would no longer be available. And I'm like, wow. So I looked up. Abraham Lincoln declared the freedom of those enslaved through the Emancipation Proclamation, obviously. He guided America through arguably her darkest hour, which was the Civil War. He fought and won the Civil War, America's bloodiest, where brother fought against brother, bringing an end to it a few days before he was assassinated. Like, he completed the Civil War 3 or 4 days, 5 days later, he was killed. But that is his legacy, the Emancipation Proclamation guiding the country through the Civil War. Nichols, Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers. He was the writer of the Declaration of Independence. He was the first Secretary of State. Interesting. He was in first Secretary of State. He was in George Washington's administration, and he became our 3rd president. He was the first of an early trend of back-to-back leaders. There were 5 or 6 back-to-back leaders who were Secretary of State and in the next term became president. And this happened like 4 or 5 times, that a Secretary of State would be a Secretary of State in one administration, run for president during the next term, which we just saw recently in the last election. Dimes, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was our only 4-term president who saw the end of the Great Depression through his New Deal, and he brought great change to the country, which included an economic turnaround. But he also led America during World War II, and he passed away just weeks before the ending of the European Campaign, or VE Day. So again, this is another person that brought America through a very tough time, both the Great Depression and World War II. And I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. Quarters, George Washington, he's called the first American. He was our first commander-in-chief, our first president, bears the distinction of the father of the nation, and he led us through the very tumultuous time of the Revolutionary War. And as president, he brought the nation together. So again, that's three of these guys that have brought America through the most significant wars that we've ever fought: the Revolutionary War with George Washington, the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln, and FDR brought us through World War II. And I'm like, wow, that's just amazing. Half dollar. John F. Kennedy was known for civil rights legislation, which was passed posthumously after his death, right? But also in calling us higher, specifically the moonshot speech, where he said we need to take a man to the moon and land him safely back to the earth in this decade. And obviously the solving of the Cuban Missile Crisis during the height of the Cold War, which
Yes.
a lot of people see that as a master stroke of diplomacy. The civil rights legislation is highly important. It very much speaks to what's happening in streets and in America today. And we're going to have to stop right here. But there's so much more left to unpack. Come back and watch the second part of this stream, and you'll hear what God is saying related to Dream 3. This, again, is unpacking Dana Coverstone's first video, his first 3 dreams. It's very important, and is very important related to the 2020 election. So again, we want to thank you, Dana, for your time, for being here with us today. And did you have anything you wanted to say?
Just glad to be here and really appreciate your interpretation and looking at these dreams and bringing this information out, especially so close to the election. I think it's important that people understand the seriousness of where we are as a nation, the necessary places we need to be as Christians and believers where we are in the nation, and to understand what God is saying to each one of us right now. So thanks for letting me be a part of this. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys, for joining us again. Watch the second part of this, and you'll be able to unpack more of the information. There's so much more to be said. Have a good night.